Okay, what do we mean by GRAMA? GRAMA, again, is the Government Records Access Management Act, and there's three basic elements to GRAMA. Number one is a general rule, and it doesn't hurt to kind of memorize this general rule, and the general rule is every government record is open, public, accessible to the public or to the media, with a couple of important exceptions. So if you start with that mindset, you're going to be way ahead. Second major element to GRAMA is that both local governments and state government are required to classify their documents as to either public or one of three different kinds of non-public, and to also schedule their records for retention. So that's obviously an administrative process. It's a fairly difficult chore, but we've been at it for 20 years now, 25 years almost. So hopefully your predecessors have already done a good job of classifying documents and scheduling them for retention. Last element of GRAMA is there's an appeals process. There's a process to request records, a process to set fees, and a process for people to appeal your response to a GRAMA request. You give away a record that somebody thinks ought to be private, they get to appeal. You refuse to give away a record because you think it's private, the requester gets to appeal. All right, with that as the background, let's start with a general rule that all records in county government are public, with exceptions. This is not a new law. This has been the law in Utah since before statehood. The original statute on this goes all the way back to the territorial days, the Civil War. And it's not a change in public policy. It's a refinement, and it's a change in the way procedures work in GRAMA. And it's helpful, again, I'll say this too many times, that public is always the default position. If the statute is silent as to whether it's public or not, you assume it's public. And that's actually set out in the statute. If the statute doesn't say this is public or this is confidential, you assume it's public, with a couple of main exceptions. One is specific. In the specific exception, Ari, these guys are really anxious for handouts. The specific exception to the rule that everything's general is if you ever see a statute that says this is not public, then that statute supersedes GRAMA, supersedes the rule that everything is public. And that can appear either in GRAMA. GRAMA has a very extensive laundry list of records that are considered public and records that are considered one of three kinds of non-public. So that's the first exception, if there's a statute on point that's specific. The second exception is kind of vague in general, and it's kind of elastic, and it's kind of a balancing test. And that's the one that says you don't give out a record if to do so would constitute an unwarranted, a clearly unwarranted invasion of public privacy. And all 5 of those words are important. Clearly unwarranted invasion of personal privacy. We're at about the middle of page 1, if you've got the handout yet. That language comes from FOIA, the Federal Freedom of Information Act. Be aware that FOIA does not apply to counties in Utah. It only applies to the federal government and their agencies. And so if somebody comes in and says, you need to give me this record under FOIA, you can always tell them no. However, you'll learn early on that GRAMA is a much broader statute, much more liberal statute, grants more access than FOIA does. And so if you send them away and say, get out of here, I'm not going to respond to a FOIA request, they go home, they read about GRAMA, they're going to come back, they might be a little bit unhappy. One of the things we need to do early on is define what's a record and what does the law apply to. And basically, the short answer is it doesn't matter what the format is. If it's a means of preserving or transferring information, then it's considered a record. So you obviously have books and documents, paper records, but you've got photographs and maps, and books, and videotapes, audio tapes. For those of you who haven't been practicing for 35 years, a videotape is a I don't know if they ever changed that to video discs, but anyway, that's in the statute. So electronic media, computer data, emails, microfilms, as long as it's possible to make a copy of that record and give it to a requester. One of the issues we struggle with quite a bit this day and age, last 10 years, is how do we deal with electronic media? And we'll cover that in a little bit more detail later on. Electronic media being emails and the social media, Twitter and texting, and how about phone messages, voicemail? So those are some of the issues that might come up. So number one, we know what a document is. It's any kind of way of storing or transferring information. Number two, it's subject to GRAMA, that piece of information, if the government receives it, or owns it, or keeps it. And it's not necessary that the government do that, those three things, pursuant to any particular statute. So if you collect a certain kind of information, and even though it may not be required to do so by statute, if you do it as part of a government activity, then it might be subject to GRAMA. And GRAMA also includes a list of things that are not treated as records. And where are we on page 2, I think? This would be materials which are owned by the employee rather than the government. It could be temporary drafts, and a temporary draft has to be temporary in a draft, okay? So that's not too hard to keep that track. But there's a big Supreme Court case on the issue of what's a temporary draft. And the Attorney General's office did a lackluster job of trying to say certain documents were temporary drafts, even though they had been circulated and had been relied on. Copyrighted materials, so that might be a copyrighted book, copyrighted magazine, computer programs, personal calendars or notes, computer programs, junk mail. That's actually in GRAMA. It's not defined, but it's like pornography. You know it when you see it. And judicial or quasi-judicial decision makers' deliberation notes. Some of you folks are going to be quasi-judicial deliberators in various kinds of administrative hearings, especially you county commissioners, county council members. So that's what a record is, and that's what a record's not. Now we go on to 4 classifications of records. And you've got 1 classification of public, and you've got 3 classifications of non-public or confidential. I've said it before, I'll say it again. Public record is always the default position. We're going to assume a record's public unless we find something specific that says it's not. So GRAMA lists does a specific list, a laundry list of some of the things that are automatically public. Laws, public employee salaries, and these are just the express provisions in GRAMA. Other job-related information like job title, final opinions and decisions, legal opinions, open meeting minutes, land records, you recorders, initial police reports, you sheriffs, and payments to contractors. That's obviously not an exhaustive list, and there are tons of other records that you hold and maintain in your various divisions, departments, elected offices that are going to be classified as public. And the reason you have to know whether it's public or not public is that affects who gets a hold of it, who gets access to the record. Public record, anybody could get a hold of the record for any purpose. Commercial purposes, harassment purposes. Basically, there's not a limitation on who gets hold of a public record. These other 3 kinds of confidential records, that's the distinguishing characteristic, is there's a limit on who can get a hold of the record. The first classification of confidential records is private records. And that's a record where a privacy right is held by an individual specifically. So it deals with an individual by name or easily ascertainable, and it includes information that normal people would consider private. There are some examples, again, listed in GRAMA, and you see them there in your handout. Medical data, unemployment eligibility, personal identifiers, library records, financial information. And then you also have this elastic one that says a clearly unwarranted invasion of personal privacy. So those are the records that are considered private. And again, you can look at another statute, and if it's another statute like the juvenile Code of Juvenile Procedure, criminal procedure, you'll find that most records related to juveniles in the court system are private. And so that record is going to supersede the GRAMA general rule that everything's public. The second form of confidential information is what's called control records. And you'll very, very rarely deal with these unless maybe you have involvement with the health department. And a controlled record is a medical or mental health record where the doctor says, whatever you do, don't give access to this record to the patient. And maybe an obvious example would be the doctor does a psychiatric psychiatric examination of a patient and says, this guy's suicidal. The least little thing could tip him over. And so the doctor would say, whatever you do, don't give this diagnosis to the patient. So you're going to rarely run into those. And now can you see where these classifications in GRAMA affect who has access to the record? Most medical information is going to be private, which means the subject of the record gets access to it. But this is a specific kind of private information where not even the subject of the record, the patient, has access to it. Bottom page 2, protected records. Now these are records where the government entity has a privacy interest rather than an individual. And there's another long list in GRAMA, includes trade secrets and test questions. And test questions might be at the university. They might be in your merit system. Real property values, any kind of information that might jeopardize life or safety, attorney-client records, records of closed meetings, audits, investigation procedures, jail security, things like that. So basically those are records that deal with a government process that has some kind of a critical aspect of it that the government, the people represented by the government, have a legitimate expectation that that record's not going to be made available to the public. Okay, movie quotes. This ought to be an easy one. The Pirate's Code is more what you'd call guidelines than actual rules. Pirates of the Caribbean. These are bouncing off the guy's hands, okay? All right, what's the life lesson learned from there are more guidelines than actual rules? Interpretation. Some rules are not as important as other rules, right? I think I heard that there first. Okay. This is a very obscure movie, but I love it. I love this quote. No, kid, if this were heaven, we'd be eating Pop-Tarts with Kim Novak. Nobody's going to get this, okay? So it goes right there. That movie is Rango. It's a animated movie about a lizard, and I love that quote. And this is an eternal truth, actually. What's the eternal truth you learn? Everybody has a different concept of heaven, and that's okay. Okay. Roses are red, violets are blue. I'm schizophrenic, and so am I. What? I heard, what about Bob all the way in the back? Okay, life's lesson learned. I'm schizophrenic, and so am I. There are crazies, and they deserve love too, don't they? Okay, good. You guys you're gonna come out ahead on this one. Let's see, where are we? The requesting process. Let me get back. I said I'd come back later to e-records of various kinds. And just in brief a summary, this isn't in your handout, e-records are pretty well governed by exactly the same record or the same rules that govern hard copy paper records. Number one, the medium doesn't matter. So e-records, if you can recreate them, you can make copies of them and you can give them to somebody, then it might be covered by GRAMA. Is it the government's business or is it personal? And obviously some e-records are going to be personal and others are going to be governmental. Is it held by the government? And that's an interesting problem. Our technical folks say once something gets out in the cloud, the government doesn't hold it anymore. And I'm not technical enough to know exactly how that works, but it does create a potential problem. So, luckily, so far in Salt Lake County, we've had lots of records requests for emails, and those are pretty easy to figure out. So far, I've never had to deal with a records request dealing with something that's out in the cloud or the social media. Can it be duplicated? And this is pretty important. What's the retention schedule? Remember, we talked about one of the key indicators, the key issues regarding GRAMA is a retention schedule. What would you guess? You folks are experienced communicators, or you wouldn't be here. What do you think would be the average time you ought to keep an email, just based on administrative necessity? And I'm just talking about average emails. You could even say 90% of emails. How long are they? 6 months? That's probably 6 months too long. As an experiment in Salt Lake County, I was involved in a group that was trying to figure out what to do with emails and other social media. And for a couple of months, we all kept track of our own emails, our own personal emails. And we classified them just informally amongst ourselves as to what would be an adequate retention schedule. And we decided, I think the figure was right around 90% of the emails that we got in a day-to-day course of business would have a retention schedule of about 1 minute. You know, just because they simply don't have any relevance, especially any long-term relevance. Gavin, how come you missed the staff meeting? I have better things to do. Yeah, and if you think about it, a lot of emails are really not long-term importance. Usually when we have a record that we might keep 6 months or 6 years or forever, we almost always convert it over to hard copy. And those would be records about important policy decisions and things like that. The stuff that comes over on an email about an important policy practice or decision are just give and take and rough drafts and things like that. And so we tend to not have to worry as much about e-records in terms of retention schedule. And retention schedule is important because retention schedule affects how long you have to keep it, and it has a King's X. That if somebody asks for a record after the retention schedule is expired, you don't have to give it to them. I learned the hard way. Our office, the prosecutor's side of our office, has a retention schedule of 7 years for most felony records excepting homicides. And so I get a records request from some guy who's out at the prison. I didn't think he was going to come in and file an appeal. But anyway, he asked for his own criminal prosecution record of a crime he was convicted of about 14 years earlier. So I do a kind of a half-hearted look through our computer system and says, no, we've got a retention schedule of only 7 years. Send him this note back, says, no, we have our retention schedule 7 years. If you want to appeal, go ahead and appeal. When that process of looking around, I'd ask the archives folks, just to take a quick look. So about 3 months after I send this letter back to this guy in jail, here comes this record. 14 years later, 7 years after it should have been destroyed. I looked through the record and I decided, no, you don't deserve this. All right. I don't have a clock, so I don't know how much time I'm using. Real quickly, in terms of a local ordinance, a local government, a county or a city, can pass an ordinance that gives you a couple of advantages in the GRAMA process. It gives you a little bit of slack as to how you define records, and it gives you a little bit of slack as to the time frame in responding to a records request. And it also allows you to create your own internal appeals process. So if somebody doesn't like your decision, you can appeal it through your county commission or your county council rather than to go to Salt Lake to the State Records Committee. So that's an advantage in some cases to having a local ordinance on GRAMA. The records requester needs to be pretty specific about the request for information. And then the government is required to respond within a certain deadline. And the rule of thumb is 10 days. Except if it's a reporter and they want the record for publication, then the rule of thumb is 5 days. Let me tell you a secret about reporters. 5 days is like eternity, okay? When they want the record, they want it yesterday. So again, you may be 100% right by saying, hey, I've got 5 days to respond to this, but you might lose anyway. There's a process for getting extensions on those deadlines. If you need to do extensive editing of a record, suppose one record has both private information, confidential information, and public information, and you have to go through and black stuff out, redact stuff. If you're currently using the record for audit purposes or something like that, you can get an extension on that 10-day deadline. The most common one that comes up is you get an extension if you have to send it to the attorney's office and ask the attorney's office whether or not this is a public record. And the rule of thumb there is I tell everybody it's 4 to 6 weeks, and somehow that's been translated as 46 weeks. But it's not nearly that long. Yes, go ahead. Yep. No, it's not an exception, and it is something you have to live with. And the way you deal with that is you are entitled to charge the cost of gathering up the record. And that includes indirects, paper or disk, and employee time. And the rule is that the employee time has to be priced out at an hourly wage that the least competent person can gather that record up. Sometimes that might be an attorney, and sometimes it might just be a file clerk. But it's something you have to live with, and that's too bad, but that's basically what the law is designed to do. There's an interesting case in the State Records Committee. There's a woman named Schwartz in Salt Lake City, and she had a little apartment in the Perry Hotel. Do you know where that is? And it must have been floor to ceiling with boxes of records. She sent a records request to the University of Utah saying, give me all the records you have about the Eisenhower administration. How do you even deal with that? So the university appealed, and the State Records Committee said that's far too voluminous, too vague, too widespread, that it's not even reasonable. How do you come up with a cost? As I mentioned, you can charge the cost of employee time. As a general rule, you only have to really sit down and count the cost in these really extraordinary records requests that might not come up very often. In Salt Lake County, we were dealing for a couple of years with Kennecott about releasing big tracts of land on the west side of the Salt Lake Valley. The West Bench development project was going to be one of the biggest planning and zoning spectaculars in the entire United States. And the Tribune decided they want to have all the records that we had on that. And we ended up with 2 big banker boxes, and a lot of the space in those banker boxes was disks. So it was tons and tons of information, but the Trib did have to end up paying for it. There's a great case out of Davis County. The Davis County burn plant had a general rule: we're just going to charge you $20 an hour to respond to Grandma's request. And the requester takes that up to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court says, no, $20 is probably a pretty good guess. It doesn't have to be perfect, but as long as it's a good guess, that'll do. You can charge the cost, again, employee time of editing or redacting out confidential information that might be intermixed in what's otherwise public. And if you deny a records request, then you have to tell the reasons why you denied it. And the reason would typically be, this is not public under GRAMA, or we don't have it. It's amazing how often that comes up and how little faith people have in their government when you say, we don't have that record. And then you tell them what the appeals process is in your county. Top page 4, the appeal goes to the county chief administrative officer. That's not really defined in statute. What we do in Salt Lake County is we treat that as the highest department official, including the elected officials. So if a request goes to the sheriff's office, then the highest administrative officer in the sheriff's office we treat as being the sheriff rather than county commissioner, county council. Records retention, talked about that a little bit already. Let's not forget the movie quotes. Greater good, I'm your wife. I'm the greatest good you're ever going to get. Incredibles. All right. What's the life's lesson learned from that quote? That's exactly. That is all of these are easy. I'm a Mog. I'm half man and half dog. I'm my own best friend. Spaceballs. Oops. Oh, okay. Who said it over here? Who likes Snickers enough to own up to it? Oh, that's a good arm. I'm going to give these to you. And what's the life's lesson learned? I'm my own best friend. Like yourself. All right. Where are we? Records retention. Again, like I said, this is a big key to GRAMA, and it's especially key when it comes to e-records. And the only issue is GRAMA doesn't give you any specifics about how to decide what's a good retention schedule. But it says when you come up with your own retention schedule, you have to send a copy of it to the state archives. State archives does not have the authority to approve or disapprove of your retention schedule, but they do have authority to say you're not keeping that long enough, so at the end of your retention schedule, we're going to grab the record and keep it for the length of time we think ought to be the retention schedule. The things that you might give some thought to is, say it's a record about a contract. You're obviously not going to throw the record out before the contract is completed. Potential for litigation, including appeals. Potential for historical value. Some records have historical value that suggests we ought to keep them forever. And then you keep not only your retention schedules with state archives, you have to send up all of your classifications, all of your designation as to which of the 4 kinds of either public or 3 kinds of non-public, and you have to send up any ordinances or rules to state archives so they have access to all the local government's rules. Again, they don't have an approval authority, but you have to give it to them. And there's a case out of the Records Committee that says, I think it was Duchesne County, did I hear Duchesne County here? Where they had a records request and they denied it based on a county ordinance, and they'd never filed the county ordinance with state archives. And so state archives says that ordinance is bogus. You have to go by state law. What are penalties and remedies? I'll just have you glance at some of those real quickly. It is potentially Class B misdemeanor, and that's for intentionally disclosing a record, for improperly gaining access yourself to a confidential record, or refusing to release a record that ought to be public. There's civil enforcement, which means the government goes in. It could be the county attorney, the district attorney, or a private citizen, and says, it files an injunction, says in the future you need to give out this record. And GRAMA specifically provides for employment disciplinary action for GRAMA violations. Okay, here's a series of 3 quotes, I think, all related to those of us who are getting just a little bit older day by day. Time marches on, and sooner or later you realize it's marching right across your face. You're looking like you've heard that quote. No? Oh, anybody? Steel Magnolias? Nobody? Okay. It's not the years, honey. It's the mileage. Right, there's the last arc. Who said that? Oh, way, all the way at the back. Well, that's no good. All right. Lately, I've come to realize that the years ahead are fewer than the years behind. Nobody will know that one. That's Jean-Luc Picard, Star Trek Insurrection. I like those getting old quotes because, this may surprise you, I'm getting old. All right, I label the next section Step 2 in the GRAMA process. What is Step 2? So we've gone through all this process of deciding what's public and non-public and how we're going to respond to a records request. And I mentioned earlier before that you can be 100% legally correct and still get in trouble. And that's kind of Step 2. Step 2 comes from the fact that GRAMA says you always put a balancing test in this process of deciding whether to release a record. And the balancing test says is something that may otherwise legitimately be classified as non-public, have so much public interest that you ought to release it anyway. And GRAMA thinks that's so important a principle, it says it seven times. So, and you know how often that comes up in a discussion inside the government about how to, whether or not to release a record? Never. Do you know how often it comes up in the case law or in the State Records Committee? Every single case. So you might, again, you might be completely 100% legally correct and still be wrong because you didn't go through a kind of a societal public policy balancing test. And some of the case law goes so far as to suggest that any public interest could outweigh a privacy interest. And there's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy that says if the news is asking for it, that means there's strong public interest, and you ought to consider releasing it. So I know most of you have very little experience in government, but this kind of discussion never comes up. Never comes up. Should we balance this? What's the balance? What's the good public policy? Should we release it or not release it? And when we don't do that, then we're not fulfilling GRAMA's requirements. A couple of very good recent cases, Deseret News versus Salt Lake County. I have to confess this happened on my watch. And SUA versus the AGRC. And they're very strongly worded cases from the Utah Supreme Court saying, you local governments, you need to get your head screwed on straight. GRAMA is not about trying to find a way to keep people from getting a record. It's a way to find, it's a process to find a way to help them get access to a record. In the Deseret News case, Salt Lake County had a sexual harassment complaint in the county clerk's office, and the chief deputy clerk was accused of sexual harassment. And the county conducted an investigation, hired outside investigators to look into this. And the county had already done a classification. They said, whenever we do a sexual harassment complaint investigation, we will classify it as personal and classify it as protected because it's part of an investigation process. How many of you think that would be a pretty good? Most of us would think, yeah, that's a pretty good thing. But the court says, no, you can classify it, you can pre-classify it all you want. But when it comes down to a specific request for a specific document, your general classification goes out the window. You have to sit down and look at that record and decide whether that record ought to be released or not to the public. And they had 4 major holdings in this case. The court acknowledges that there's a legislative intent. It's already been adopted by the legislature. It's all over that records be open. As I mentioned, the county should have examined the individual record, not relied on a general classification. GRAMA requests are not adversarial combat. And let me read a quote from the case in just a second. And this was very interesting. One of the reasons we said, well, we can't release investigations because that exposes investigation techniques. It embarrasses people, and not just the victim and the perpetrator, but it embarrasses all these witnesses and stuff like that. And in the future, we won't be able to do as good an investigation because people will know we're going to give it out, so they'll keep quiet. The court said, bogus. We're not buying any of that. That's what the court said. GRAMA does not contemplate adversarial combat over record requests. It instead envisions an impartial, rational balancing of competing interests. To be sure, a requesting party may disagree with the government entity over the classification of a record, but the overriding allegiance of the government, fill in your own county name there, must be the goals of GRAMA and is not its preferred record classification. When a government entity follows this approach, the requesting party can be assured upon receiving a denial that the entity has honored the purpose and intent of GRAMA and that the grounds cited in the denial were not uncovered in a, quote, single-minded quest for reasons to turn away the records requester. Strong language. It really, seriously, that is really something that needs to guide our approach to GRAMA. It's a fresh look at GRAMA. That's cases, I think, about 5 years old. How are we on time? 1:20. So I've done like 40 minutes? Okay. I'll be quick. Open meetings. And one of the things I do is I always confuse. I'm going to say open meetings when I mean GRAMA, and I'm going to say GRAMA when I mean open meetings. If I get those confused, we're talking about open meetings now. Movie quotes. I'm your Huckleberry. Tombstone. All right, I like it. What's the life's lesson you learned from that? You never know who your Huckleberry's going to be, right? Your Huckleberry might be sitting right here in this room. Excuse me, stewardess. I speak jive. Airplane. I could tell by the laugh. Being multilingual is a good thing. Edwina's insides were a rocky place where my seed could find no purchase. What? I heard it. Raising Arizona. All the way. Where is it? All the way. Oh boy. All right. What's life's lesson learned? Sometimes life deals you a rocky place. Okay, that's part of life. All right. Open meetings law. Again, the rule is you could be 100% correct, still get in trouble with the press or the media. Open Meetings Act really depends, its application really depends on a couple of definitions. And those definitions are defining meeting, defining convening, and defining a public body. So let's kind of go through those. First of all, the act is not going to apply unless there's a meeting. And a meeting is, number one, convening. We'll define that in a second. Number two, a public body. We'll define that in a second. In person electronically with a quorum present to act upon some matter within the public body's jurisdiction. Okay? Take out any four of those elements, and it's not a meeting that's subject to the Open Meetings Act. Well, what does convening and public body means? Convening means to, number one, call together. Number two, a meeting. Number three, of a public body, which we'll define in a second. Number four, by the chair. Number five, to act upon something within the jurisdiction. Okay, again, you take out any one of those five elements, it's not a convening, and it's not subject to the Open Meetings Act. C, number three, public body. This is an interesting one, and it's important to understand exactly what the law says on this, and you'll decide whether or not, to what extent, some of the groups that you meet with are public bodies for open meetings purposes. Number one, it's any kind of an administrative, advisory, executive, or legislative body, so it's kind of covering at least two elements of basic government, the executive and legislative branch. Advisory is important. Sometimes we say, well, this bid review committee is not going to make a final decision. They're only going to make a recommendation to the county commission to decide whether or not to hire this contractor. Well, when they make a recommendation, they've gone through a decision-making process. So bear in mind that public body does include advisory bodies, and that making a recommendation is a decision process. C1 there is a very important one. It has to be created formally. has to be created by constitution, by statute, rule, resolution, or county ordinance. So if you've got an ad hoc committee that's not created in any kind of formal sense, you get a bunch of citizens together to help the county commission decide where to locate a rec center, where to locate a park, something like that. That's not necessarily going to be part of the Subject of Public Meetings Act. However, if you keep that meeting quiet, you're probably going to regret it. So, again, that's the notion that you can be completely 100% legally correct and still regret your decision. The press never lets go of this kind of stuff. They just never. And you have say you get this ad hoc committee of public-spirited citizens to decide where you're going to put in a county park. And every time the press mentions that process, they're going to say, in a secret meeting of such and such. And they will do that for 5 years. They have very long memories. So when it comes to the Open Meetings Act, don't rely so much on the law as you do on, is there really a good reason to exclude the public from this decision process? And again, back to your ad hoc committee to cite the county park, probably not a very good reason to not allow the public to come in until you get to the point where you're identifying specific properties and trying to decide what the value of that property is and trying to decide how much the county's going to offer. Then there's obviously good reasons to keep that process quiet. Public body consists of 2 or more persons. It either spends or is supported by tax money. And here's another important one. This is the middle page 4, or page 1, item 4. It's number 1, vested. So that's, again, talking about some specific statutory empowering, is vested with the authority to make decisions regarding public business. All right, so let me get this one here too, just for our county commissioners. There are 2 exceptions when a public body has both legislative and administrative functions. Okay, executive functions, how many of those do we have? Which is the biggest in county government, has both executive and legislative functions? The county commission, obviously. So they act as both a mayor and a county council. They act as governor and legislature. And so when you do both of those, county commissioners, and when you get together for a meeting, and this is what you discuss, you only discuss administrative matters. So you're saying, we're going to assign the road crew to go out and do this road this week and that road next week. And you spend no money, you take no formal action, and you consider matters that are usually not on the county commission agenda. Then you're okay. Again, you may be 100% legally correct, and you may still need to say, is there really a good reason why we're going to exclude the public from this meeting? What kind of entities are covered by that then in counties? You got a list there, bottom page 1, top page 2. This is just a very partial list. County commissions and councils, Board of Equalization, Board of Health, Library Board, Mental Health Board, Board of Adjustment, Planning Commissions, Boundary Commissions. All these are created by statute, or sometimes they're created by county ordinance. Because of that, then they're going to be typically going to be covered by the Open Meetings Law. There are 2 big procedural requirements in the Open Meetings Law. And this is where the devil is in the details. And the 2 big procedural requirements are notice and minutes. And the notice, and you can make a technical violation of the Open Meetings Law by doing the wrong notice or insufficient notice or no notice at all. And you can also violate the Open Meetings Act by not keeping minutes correctly. So notice requirements, number 1, you do an annual notice if you've got a body that meets regularly all year long. So your county commission meets on the 2nd and 4th Tuesdays of each month. You do an annual notice and say, County Commission of Bonneville County meets on the 2nd and 4th Tuesdays at such and such a location, such and such a time, and that's your annual notice. And then you do a 24-hour notice, at least 24 hours in advance, that explains what kinds of things you're going to talk about at the next meeting. So this is a specific notice that requires date, time, place, and agenda. And to publish this notice, you need to post it at your meeting place, and you put it on the State Archives website. And the people who need to know this are your secretaries and your attorneys and people like that. But just so you know, that website is utah.gov/PMN/index. Excuse me. Where are we? Emergency meetings can be held for an unforeseen emergency, urgent matters. So you've got 24-hour notice, something comes up, and you have to discuss it. You have to discuss it. You just learned about it last night or this morning. What do? Those terms are not defined anywhere, unforeseen, emergency, and urgent, but you probably ought to attach the usual English language definitions to those. Unforeseen, did nobody know about it? Urgent. And in that case, you give the best notice practicable. And oftentimes this takes the form of a walk-on agenda item. And when you do a walk-on agenda item, you usually do 2 votes. The first vote is to somebody says, this is why we didn't get it to you in time for the notice. It's unforeseen, urgent, and emergency. And so you vote to say, yes, this is unforeseen, urgent, emergency. Let's discuss it. And then you do a vote on the actual item. Obviously, it should be obvious to us that we don't use that inappropriately, try and pull one over on the media, the public. But again, look at the ordinary English language definition of those 3 words. There's no specific description of how specific the agenda has to be. But obviously, if it's unspecific, then it ceases to become a valuable agenda. Is an item like, quote, closed item, litigation, unquote, okay? Yeah, that's probably okay. In other cases, you might need to be more specific in the agenda. Minutes in open meetings. There's also a minutes requirement for closed meetings, but just for open meetings, just go through those quickly. There have to be both a written and audio recording. The written minutes had to include these specific details, date, time, place, members present, agenda, substance of discussion. Does not need to be a word-for-word transcript like a court reporter would do for a trial. It has to be good detailed minutes. The audio recording must be complete of all the open portion of the meeting, and it has to be available to the public within 3 days. Well, you say, we're not even meeting as a county commission until next week. How can we give out these minutes that have not been approved in a follow-up meeting? And the answer is that's okay. You just go ahead and release them anyway, but get a stamp that says these minutes have not yet been approved. In that way, they're at least not official minutes until they've been approved in a later meeting. These are open records, ought to be obvious under GRAMA. And that's about it there, okay. Excuse me. Life comes at you pretty fast. If you don't stop and look around, you might miss it. Ferris Bueller, where's that? Good for you. You know what are the symptoms of torn rotator cuff? You can't throw anymore. You can't sidearm, you can't underarm, you can't overarm, you can't nothing. That one kind of speaks for itself. I'm not going to ask for the life's lesson in that one. This one I'm going to ask for the life's lesson, and you get extra credit. I got no time to bleed. Predator. And extra credit, who's the actor? Jesse Ventura, who said that? Governor of one of those flyover states. What, Minnesota? Okay, what's the life's lesson learned? I got no time to bleed. You got to set priorities. You know? Sometimes you got to do this. Sometimes you got to do that. Don't mix them up. Okay, minutes and closed meetings. You do have to keep minutes. They're a little bit different. Audio recordings are mandatory. Written minutes are optional. Again, you disclose time, place, members present. You don't necessarily have to disclose the matters discussed. And I'm not going to get into too much detail. There's some rules about what is specifically being discussed as to whether or not you include those in the minutes. And those are obviously protected documents under GRAMA, so they don't get out very often. And just look at item 4 there. That gives you kind of an idea of what kinds of things don't need to be in the minutes. But how about electronic meetings? It's gotten to the point now where we could have a meeting where you might have only a certain number of council members or commissioners present in the council chambers, and you got somebody else is in by telephone or speakerphone or even electronic media. Number one rule, if you want to encompass that, make that permissible in your boards or your public bodies, your county commission, you have to have a policy that says we're going to do that. And there's specific elements that have to be included in the policy in the open meetings law, and some of them are flexible to give you some options. Some of the rules you have to include is, number one, you have to have a quorum present physically. Number two, you have to designate an anchor location, which is a location which you'll always use for that electronic meeting, which is going to be typically going to be your council or commission chambers. And you have to have a process where the public can listen in. So obviously, if you've got an open phone, then the public can hear the absent speaker. But if you have something that's done by typed out text or emails, then you've got to set it up some way that members of the public can still follow the discussion. A couple of training items. There's an annual training requirement for all the boards in all the world, all the county boards. It doesn't say how long it has to be, but it does say the penalty for not complying is a Class B misdemeanor. Looks bad on your re-election record. And then the Attorney General is responsible to send an annual notice regarding any legislative changes. I don't know if that's ever happened, Adam. Do you think that's ever happened? I'm not sure it has. Movie quotes. One of my favorite movies. Miss Jean Louise, stand up. Your father's passing by. To Kill a Mockingbird. Who said that? And what's the lesson learned? Some people really do deserve our respect. Okay? These are not that hard. I should have said there's no wrong answers to the life's lesson learned, okay? Be bold. Here's another special movie quote. This is special because exactly the same movie line was said in two different unrelated movies by the same actor. Must go faster, must go faster. Extra credit for the actor. Beg pardon? Jurassic Park is one of them, and the actor is Jeff Goldblum, and the other movie is Independence Day, also Jeff Goldblum. And what's the life's lesson learned? Sometimes you have to go faster. All right. Where am I? Am I done? I'm not even close to done. When can you close a meeting? There's certain statutory reasons, exceptions, that allow you to close a meeting to the public. And closure is not automatic. It's a specific process. There's 5 procedural requirements to close a meeting. Number one, it has to begin as an open meeting, so that means it has to have the 24-hour agenda and everything like that. Suppose you're going to have the only item on your agenda is going to be a closed item. Still have to have an agenda. Agenda meeting tomorrow, such and such time, place, agenda item 1, litigation, closed meeting. So you have to do that. Number 2, there has to be a motion by one of the board members to close the meeting. And there has to be a 2/3 supermajority vote. It has to be one of the specific exceptions, which we'll talk about in just a minute. You cannot do any formal approvals or formal adoption of ordinances or contracts or anything like that in a closed part of a meeting, and you do have to keep minutes, as mentioned earlier. Yes, go ahead.
You mentioned quorum, and we had a discussion about what constitutes a quorum, and certain commissions or councils have more than 3.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just a simple majority. So in this case, you've got a supermajority. Obviously, a simple majority, supermajority in a county commission is the same thing. But if you've got our county council is 9 members, so a simple majority is 5, but a supermajority would be 6 to vote in favor. Other questions? I should have invited questions as we've gone along. Have I trotted over your questions as we've gone along? Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. 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 So, so you discuss it in your closed meeting. You tell your real estate guy to go out and offer this amount of money. He comes back and says the property owner wouldn't accept that, but he'll accept this. The county commission says, okay, go back and offer him this. This is all closed meeting, right? And your sales guy goes back and offers the property owner such and such. He says yes. So the deal's all done. It's all been a confidential meeting up to this point. And then at a regular county commission meeting, you have an agenda item that says purchase of property at such and such a location, purchase price such and such. Okay? The reasons you can close a meeting is number one, this comes up quite a bit, discuss the character, competence, or health of an individual. That's a person, that's an individual. So it's any kind of personnel matters. It does not include the character, competence, or health of a business. So you can't use that to discuss a contract with some business. You can do strategy sessions, and let's define strategy sessions. That's a situation where you're going to discuss options, strengths and weaknesses of a certain course of action, recommendations, consider a course of action, and decide on make a decision. And that comes from a Supreme Court case that I took to the Supreme Court many years ago, defining strategy sessions. So, strategy session to discuss collective bargaining, pending or reasonably imminent litigation, and that means you're almost certain it's going to happen. Either the complaint's been filed or you're pretty certain it's going to happen. And litigation also includes litigation in administrative agencies, like the tax commission. And that was the case I took up, Tribune versus Salt Lake County. It was a case where the Tribune wanted to know the strategy advice the attorney's office had given regarding a boundary commission decision. And the court held the boundary commission was a litigation and a quasi-judicial administrative hearing. Strategy sessions regarding buying and selling real estate. Discussions regarding deployment of security, personnel or devices, criminal misconduct, or certain taxpayer commercial information. There's a couple of other meeting exceptions. That's the list, the specific list. You're always going to have a safe harbor with those lists. There's some other statutory exceptions we've already discussed. Chance or social meetings, and a county commission meeting for administrative discussions. How about a staff meeting? Sheriff wants to hold a meeting with his lieutenants, his jail commander, his sergeants, and just say, we need to do this. This is going to be a new policy. Is that covered by the Open Meetings Act? How come? It's administrative, number one. Number two, that group is not created by statute. It has no authority to make a decision regarding the public's business. They make recommendations or give advice back to the sheriff's office or to the sheriff himself, and then he makes that decision. That applies, of course, to any of the elected offices. A couple of interesting case law exceptions. It's kind of discouraging to realize how many of these are my cases, including some that we lost. If you have deliberations regarding decisions when you're a quasi-judicial administrative agency, that is, the county commission may be sitting as appeal in a planning and zoning issue, then you're conducting a quasi-judicial administrative hearing. When you do your deliberations, when you go in the back room and say, I didn't like this part of the discussion, I thought that guy made a good point, that kind of give and take, that doesn't have to be in an open meeting. When you're just doing administrative affairs, this Harper versus Summit County case, the planning commission was just signing letters, discussing the letter with staff, signing letters, stamping permits, pure administrative business. Court says, no, that's not public meetings, not covered by public meetings. This Ward versus Richfield City case is an interesting case where the city was discussing firing the police chief, and they held a closed meeting discussing the character competence of an individual, and then they reopened. Here's a little safety tip. Do you want some really juicy stuff? Schedule it for midnight, okay? Everybody goes home. Anyway, it was like 10 o'clock at night. And so rather than open the doors and say, the closed part of the meeting's over, you can come back in, the county commission, or the city council just kept right on going. And the Supreme Court called that, quote, bad practice. But they said it wasn't a violation of the Open Meetings Act. And then lastly, discussing a matter over which the public body has no jurisdiction. This Hutchinson case was a case where the sheriff was discussing whether or not to fire a deputy. He was discussing it with the county commission. And the court said, hey, county commissions have nothing to do with firing deputies. That's clearly solely within the sheriff's authority. This is an easy one. Sir, the odds of successfully navigating an asteroid field are approximately 3,720 to 1. Star Wars, okay, next, extra credit, what's the next line? Never tell me the odds. Okay, how many of these have you got, Adam? What do you do? What's the life's lesson learned? Reality is more important than the odds, okay? And I actually was looking this up. I was trying to find the exact number, 3,720 to 1. And there's all sorts of websites that say, what are the real chances of getting smashed in an asteroid field? And they say it's not even close to 3,700 to 1. It's more the opposite. You've got a 1 in 5 million chance of getting smashed to bits in an asteroid field. So that's another life's lesson learned, is never listen to the gold droid. Okay, last movie quote. So you see, there are two kinds of people in this world, my friend. Those with loaded guns and those who dig. You dig. What's life's lesson learned? There's no, have a loaded gun. I like that one. The one I put down is that there's two kinds of people in the world. Those who classify everybody into two groups and those who don't. All right, sanctions and enforcement, you can just look through that. Again, we're talking criminal sanctions. You have to be really careful. This Ward versus Richfield City has another interesting decision attached to it that says if the city or the county screws up an open meetings issue, has a meeting that should have been opened and closed it, they can go ahead and run and fix it by having another meeting a week later. And how about public participation? Does open meetings law mean you have to allow anybody and everybody to come to the meeting and spout off and talk about anything and everything they want to talk about? No. Open meetings law just says you need to allow somebody to come and listen. And so do we as county commissioners allow them to speak up? Of course we do. But you can set all sorts of limits. You might typically have a public comment time at the beginning of your meeting. Public comments are limited to 3 minutes each. If you have a comment about an item that's on the agenda, wait until that agenda item comes up. Anyway, you've got all sorts of authority to limit the public's participation, other than you can't limit them coming and listening. Last questions? Have I missed anybody's favorite movie quote? No, huh? Okay. How'd I do on time? Oh, okay.